She was one of the most powerful women in the country, worth $3 billion, feared in boardrooms, photographed on magazine covers. And in 30 seconds flat, a crowded diner full of strangers turned her into a punchline. One dropped spoon, one careless sentence. And just like that, the laughter started. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't explain herself. She couldn't even say her own name without destroying everything she'd spent years protecting. But one man, a nobody, a single dad with coffee-stained cuffs and a beat-up truck, heard the laughter and did something no one else in that room was willing to do. If this story hits different for you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most mornings did in Clover Falls. Quietly, without ceremony, with the particular kind of gray light that settled over small towns like a wool blanket that had been washed too many times. Thin, familiar, slightly suffocating if you thought about it too long. Ethan Brooks didn't think about it too long. He hadn't had time to think too long about anything in 3 years. He pulled his truck into the parking lot of Millie's Corner Diner at 7:52 a.m. 8 minutes later than usual, because Lily had decided that morning was the morning she absolutely could not go to school with her hair in a regular ponytail. It had to be 2 braids or nothing, and she'd stood at the bathroom mirror with her arms crossed and her chin pushed out, that stubborn set to her jaw she'd inherited from him, the one he recognized every time he caught himself in a reflection. And he'd spent 14 minutes with a comb and 2 rubber bands that kept snapping, until she declared the result acceptable. He hadn't eaten breakfast. He'd barely finished his coffee. The thermos in the cup holder had gone lukewarm somewhere between the elementary school drop-off and the left turn on Route 9. And he'd drunk it anyway because that was the kind of thing you did when you were a single father running on 4 hours of sleep. He sat in the truck for a minute before going in, not because he needed to, just because it was 45 seconds where nobody needed anything from him, and those 45 seconds had become the closest thing he had to a meditation practice. The diner's neon sign hummed faintly in the morning air. The open in the window was slightly crooked. It had been slightly crooked for the 2 years he'd been coming here. Ethan climbed out of the truck. Inside, Millie's was already running at its usual controlled chaos. The breakfast rush in Clover Falls was nothing like what people in cities called a breakfast rush. There were no suits pushing past each other, no orders barked into phones, no line out the door. But there was a particular density of noise that filled the space between 7:30 and 9 a.m. The clatter of coffee cups, the hiss of the griddle, the overlapping conversations of men who worked with their hands and women who had been up since 5, and the occasional shriek of a child whose parents had made the questionable decision to bring them somewhere with a hot griddle and breakable things. Ethan slid into his usual booth, third from the window, left side, and started unwrapping his silverware from the paper napkin just as Sandra came by with the coffee pot. "You look terrible," she said cheerfully, already pouring. "Thanks, Sandra." "Lily, do the hair thing again." 2 braids this time. Sandra clicked her tongue. "She's 6. It only gets worse." "I know." She moved on to the next table, and Ethan wrapped both hands around the mug and stared out the window at the parking lot. A truck like his, but newer. A sedan with a cracked rear bumper. A silver SUV with tinted windows that seemed mildly out of place, but not enough to be interesting. He picked up the laminated menu out of habit, even though he ordered the same thing every time. Scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, side of turkey sausage. He looked at it for about 4 seconds before setting it down. That was when he noticed her. Not immediately. Not in the way people notice someone beautiful or someone famous. He noticed her the way you notice something slightly off in a room. The way a picture hangs a half-inch too low. The way a chair faces the wrong direction. A small wrongness that your brain registers before your eyes quite understand what they're seeing. She was working the section near the far counter. Brown apron, hair pulled back, moving between tables with a tray and a coffee pot. She was maybe 30. Dark hair that wasn't quite staying in the clip she'd used to pin it up. She had the kind of face that made you feel like you'd seen her before, though Ethan couldn't place where. High cheekbones. A jaw that suggested she was used to clenching it. Eyes that, even from across the room, seemed to be doing something other than looking at the table she was clearing. She was watching everything. That was the thing. The other servers at Millie's, Sandra, Kevin, young Petra, who was saving up for community college. They moved through the diner on autopilot. They knew the room. They knew the regulars. They could carry a full tray and respond to a joke and calculate their tip percentage all at the same time without actually seeing any of it. The diner had become invisible to them, in the way places become invisible when you've worked in them long enough. This woman was seeing everything. She watched the table of construction workers near the window, not like someone taking their order, but like someone taking notes. She watched the family in the corner booth, two kids, exhausted mother, father, who kept checking his phone, with a kind of quiet, detached attention that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite pity. She watched the way Sandra moved through her section, efficient and warm, pausing for exactly the right amount of time before each interaction. Ethan couldn't figure out what she was doing there. New hire, maybe. That would explain the slightly awkward way she carried the tray, like someone who knew theoretically how it should be done, but hadn't built the muscle memory. But new hires at Millie's were usually local kids or someone's cousin, and there was something about this woman, the way she held herself when she wasn't actively doing something, that particular straightness in her back, that said she was neither local nor anyone's cousin. He filed it away and looked out the window again. Sandra came back with his order, sliding the plate in front of him with the comfortable efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. New girl working the far section, she said, in the low conversational tone she used for diner gossip, which was its own language at Millie's. Came in 2 days ago, says she's passing through. Frank's got her on the early shift until he figures out if she's worth keeping on. She seems like she's paying attention, Ethan said. Sandra glanced over. He refilled his coffee even though it was still mostly full. Too much attention if you ask me. Makes the regulars uncomfortable when someone looks at them like that. She moved on. Ethan ate his eggs. He wasn't watching the new woman exactly. He was just aware of her in the peripheral way. You're aware of something that doesn't quite fit. She was competent enough. She didn't drop anything. She remembered orders. She smiled when she was supposed to. But every few minutes she'd go still for just a second, like she'd forgotten where she was, and then catch herself and go back to moving. He'd seen that look before. Not on someone in a diner, but he recognized it. The look of someone who was used to a very different kind of pressure and was feeling, maybe for the first time in a while, what it was like to be anonymous. He went back to his eggs. The diner filled up around 8 o'clock, a larger crowd than usual for a Tuesday. There was some kind of planning meeting at the town hall later, and people were fueling up. The noise level climbed. The griddle behind the counter never stopped hissing. Frank, the owner, was moving between the kitchen and the front with the particular stressed energy of someone whose Tuesday was already going wrong in small ways. Ethan was on his second cup of coffee and thinking about the Henderson account, a landscaping client who wanted twice the work for half the agreed price, when it happened. The woman was moving between two tables near the counter. She had a coffee pot in her right hand and a small serving tray balanced in her left, and the breakfast rush had compressed the space between tables to somewhere between inconvenient and impossible. Someone pushed back their chair. Someone else stood up without looking. The tray tilted. The spoon hit the floor with a sharp, clean sound that cut through the ambient noise the way only metal on tile can. She bent to pick it up, and when she stood back up, her face was tight. She'd been pushing through something all morning. Ethan could see it in her jaw, in the slight stiffness in her lower back he'd noticed every time she bent to set down a plate. Whatever she'd done the night before, she was still feeling it. And in the particular way that happens sometimes when your mouth is tired and your body hurts, and you're not quite yourself, the words came out before she thought them through. "I can't close my legs," she said. "It hurts." She meant the hip flexors, or the inner thighs. Anyone who'd ever done a hard workout would have understood it instantly. That specific soreness that makes every squat and every step feel like punishment. She'd been moving carefully all morning. The dropped spoon had forced her to bend in a way her body didn't want to bend. She meant that. She meant exactly that. The diner didn't hear that. The diner heard something else entirely, and for about 2 full seconds there was a silence that was somehow louder than all the noise that had come before it, and then someone laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly. It was the involuntary, caught-off-guard kind that happens when your brain processes something unexpected. But it was enough. One laugh became two, and two became a table, and then the table nearest the window started in, and then the murmur of amusement moved through the room like a wave, picking up commentary along the way. "Well, she said it. Oh my, did she really just—" Someone at the counter actually slapped the Formica. The woman, This woman, who had been careful and competent and quietly watchful all morning, went completely still. The coffee pot was still in her hand. The tray was still in the other. And the color that climbed her neck and face was the kind that came not from embarrassment alone, but from the particular horror of understanding exactly what had just happened and knowing there was absolutely nothing she could do to undo it. Ethan watched her. He watched her mouth tighten into a smile that was not a smile. The kind of expression people put on when they're trying to tell their face to do something their face does not want to do. It was a smile you'd use to survive a moment, not enjoy it, and it didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. She set the coffee pot down on the nearest flat surface and turned toward the back of the diner. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it redistributed, clusters of conversation springing up, people leaning toward each other to share the joke, a few people pulling out phones. Ethan heard fragments. New girl needs to work on her delivery. Somebody should warn the male staff. More laughter. The woman had disappeared behind the swinging door to the back kitchen. Ethan put down his fork. There was a specific thing that happened to him sometimes in situations like this. He'd noticed it since Lily was born, though maybe it had always been there and fatherhood had just turned up the volume. A kind of discomfort that was almost physical. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling of a splinter, small and persistent and impossible to ignore. He looked around the diner. The construction workers were still laughing. The two women at the table by the register were shaking their heads with the specific expression of people who find something both inappropriate and deeply funny. Even the couple with the kids, the family he'd pegged as exhausted and stressed. Even the father had looked up from his phone long enough to smirk. Sandra passed by, and he caught her eye. She gave a small, private wince. She clearly didn't think it was funny, but she didn't say anything. She had tables to get to. Ethan looked down at his plate. The eggs had gone slightly cold. He thought about Lily's face that morning in the mirror, the careful, serious expression she'd had while she waited for him to get the braids right, the way she'd inspected his work with the solemnity of a quality control inspector. She was 6. She already knew what it felt like when someone didn't get something right about her. She already had that awareness of being looked at. He picked up his fork, put it back down. He'd been coming to Millie's for 2 years. He knew most of the people in this room, at least by face. Good people, most of them. Decent people. The kind of people who would help you if your car broke down or bring a casserole if someone got sick. The kind of people who, in any other context, would be mortified to know they'd made someone feel the way that woman clearly felt. They just hadn't thought about it. That was the thing, not cruelty. Just the particular ease of laughing at something when you didn't know whose face was behind it. He pushed the eggs around his plate. The swinging door to the back kitchen opened, and she came back out. She'd taken maybe 3 minutes, just long enough to collect herself. There was no red left in her face. She'd managed that somehow. But the careful blankness she wore now was worse, in a way. It was the look of someone who had decided to become invisible. She picked up the coffee pot from where she'd left it. She went back to her section. Someone at the counter made a comment as she passed. Something quiet, angled toward a friend, but loud enough. Ethan couldn't hear the words exactly, but he heard the tone and saw the way her shoulders pulled in by about half an inch before she corrected them. He put down his fork for the last time. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out his wallet. He counted out the money for his tab. He'd barely touched the toast, hadn't finished the sausage, and then he counted out a tip that was almost twice the cost of the meal. He set it under the edge of the coffee mug in the way he always left it, flat so it wouldn't blow if the door opened. He sat there for another minute. The laughter had mostly subsided into commentary now, that stage where a joke becomes a reference point, something people keep returning to in conversation. He heard it twice more while he sat there. Both times, he watched her. Both times she kept moving. Her face gave nothing. He thought about something his father had told him once, years ago, back when he was maybe 12 or 13 and had laughed at a kid in his class for falling off his bike. His father hadn't yelled. He just looked at him and said, "You don't know what his morning was like before that bike." And then he'd walked away and left Ethan to think about it, which had been more effective than any punishment. You don't know what her morning was like. He looked at the woman moving through her section with her too careful, too controlled walk. He looked at the room. He thought about his father. He stood up. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say. He'd had the impulse half a dozen times in the last few minutes, and each time he'd talked himself back down. It's not your business. You don't know her. You'll make it worse. She'll be embarrassed. People will think you're hitting on her. Just let it go. All the reasonable arguments, all the things people told themselves when they wanted to do the convenient thing and call it the sensible thing. He stood up anyway. Hey! He didn't raise his voice much. He didn't have to. There was a particular quality to Ethan Brooks's voice when he wanted people to pay attention, low and level, and carrying just enough weight that people who heard it tended to look up. He'd used it exactly twice in Lily's 6 years, in the specific situations where she needed to understand that he was absolutely serious, and she'd stopped what she was doing both times within about a second. People looked up. He wasn't standing on anything. He was just a man in a flannel shirt and work pants and boots with a mud streak on the left toe, standing next to a booth in a small-town diner on a Tuesday morning. He had the look of someone who'd been awake since 5:30 and was mildly tired and completely serious. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm going to say it plain because I'm not trying to make a speech." The construction workers had gone quiet. Sandra had stopped moving. Frank had appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, watching. The woman with the coffee pot was frozen near the counter. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the floor in front of her feet, and from where Ethan stood he could see the particular stillness of someone bracing for something. Not sure yet if what was coming would help or hurt. "She said her legs hurt because she worked out yesterday," Ethan said. "I watched her move through this section all morning, favoring her right hip. That's a pulled muscle. That's what that is." Silence. "Some of you laughed because it was funny. I get it. Out of context, it's funny. But she's been working in here for 2 hours trying to do her job, and now she's trying to hold it together while half the room treats her like a punchline. And that's not funny anymore. That's just people being thoughtless." He looked at the table of construction workers specifically, not with anger, just with a kind of steady directness that made two of them look at the table. "Most of you know what it's like to be in a room and have people decide they understand your situation before they have any idea what's actually going on." He paused. "So." He picked up his jacket from the back of the booth. "That's all I wanted to say." He was halfway to the door when he heard the quality of the silence change behind him. It was a different silence than before. Before had been the silence of people mid-laugh. This was the silence of people sitting with something. He pushed out the front door into the morning air, cooler than he expected. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot. His truck was third from the left. The silver SUV with tinted windows was still there, engine off. He noticed it again and forgot it again. He wasn't sure if he'd helped anything. He never was, in situations like that. There was no clear outcome, no verdict, no way to know if he'd made things better or just stranger. Maybe she'd preferred to be left alone to outlast it. Maybe he'd embarrassed her further by drawing attention. Maybe the construction workers would go back to laughing the minute the door closed behind him. He didn't know. He had a job site to get to. He had a call with the Henderson account at 10 that he was already dreading. He had a daughter who was going to want to discuss her day in very specific detail over dinner tonight, and would be annoyed if he wasn't paying attention to the right parts. He had a full, ordinary, demanding life that was waiting for him, the way it always was. He unlocked the truck. Behind him, through the glass front of the diner, he could see the shape of the room, the booths, the tables, the figures moving between them. He couldn't see her specifically from this angle, just the general fact of the place, carrying on. He got in the truck. He sat there for a second, the way he always did, 45 seconds, just for himself, and then he started the engine. The morning was already half gone. He had work to get to. He pulled out of the lot and turned right on Route 9 and didn't look back. Inside the diner, on the table he'd left, a tip sat under the edge of a coffee mug, nearly double what the meal had cost. No note, no name, just the money, the cold coffee, the half-eaten toast. And a room that had gone, in the space of 2 minutes, from laughter to something considerably quieter. The door swung shut behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Victoria Hayes stood with the coffee pot in her hand and watched the glass door stop moving and go still. And for a moment she couldn't do anything except breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her trainer had taught her years ago when the anxiety before major board presentations got bad enough to be a problem. Breathe like you mean it, not like you're apologizing for existing. She looked down at the coffee pot. Her knuckles were white around the handle. She loosened her grip. The room had changed, that much was undeniable. The laughter was gone, not faded, not wound down naturally the way laughter did when it ran out of fuel, but stopped. interrupted. Like someone had reached over and turned off a switch, and now the room was sitting in the sudden quiet of that, not quite sure what to do with itself. She could feel the discomfort from 3 tables away. The construction workers near the window had gone back to their food with the particular focus of men who were hoping the act of eating would establish that they'd never been doing anything else. The 2 women by the register were looking at their phones. The father with the kids had put his own phone face down on the table, which might have been coincidence. Sandra appeared at Victoria's elbow. "You doing okay?" she said. Low voice, direct. "Fine," Victoria said. Sandra looked at her for a beat. The look of a woman who had been reading people in a diner context for 20 years and was rarely wrong about what she saw. And then she said, "Table 4 needs a refill," and moved on. Victoria went to table 4. Her hip flexor was screaming. It had been screaming since 6:30 that morning when she'd made the mistake of taking the stairs from the parking lot to the diner's service entrance because the elevator in the building next door was occupied and she hadn't wanted to wait. 12 steps. She'd felt the first one in her left inner thigh and known, with the resigned certainty of someone who'd done this to herself before, that the day was going to be physical penance from start to finish. She'd pushed through 2 hours of it without making a sound. And then a drop spoon and 12 words and 30 seconds had undone whatever careful composure she'd been building all morning. She topped off the coffee at table 4. She smiled. The man at the table, 50s, reading a folded newspaper, looked up, nodded, looked back down. Normal. Transaction complete. She moved on. She was fine. She was not fine. The money was still there on the booth where he had been sitting. She'd seen it when she passed. Seen the amount and understood it wasn't an accident. You didn't accidentally leave a tip like that. You left a tip like that when you were trying to say something that words were going to complicate. She didn't know what to do with that, exactly. Victoria Hayes had been given things her entire adult life. Not given the way ordinary people were given things. Birthday presents, Christmas bonuses, casual generosity. Given in the way that powerful people were given things, which meant always with a cost attached. A favor expected, an access requested, an association being purchased. She had learned early and thoroughly that there was no such thing as a free lunch, and she'd learned it most literally in rooms not entirely unlike this one, back when she was 22 and broke and trying to turn a $40,000 personal loan into a company. She'd been underestimated in those rooms too, different rooms, different reasons. But the experience of standing somewhere and having people look at you and see something smaller than you were, that part wasn't new. What was new was the opposite happening. He hadn't known who she was. She was certain of that. If he'd known, the entire calculation changed. A man defending Victoria Hayes, billionaire, in a small-town diner would be defending a headline, a brand, a symbol. He would have been performing for the room, or positioning himself, or doing any number of things that people did when they understood the potential return on a gesture. He hadn't known. She was just the new waitress who'd said something embarrassing, and he'd stood up for her anyway, and then he'd walked out the door and gotten in his truck and driven away. She watched the booth he'd left. The empty mug. The plate with the cold eggs. You don't know what his morning was like? She hadn't heard all of it from across the room, but she'd heard that part. Sandra came by and cleared the booth with quick, practiced efficiency. She pocketed the tip, glanced at Victoria once without comment, and moved on. Victoria went back to her section. The breakfast rush began to thin around 8:45. It happened gradually. A table would empty, be wiped down, sit vacant for a few minutes before filling again with a smaller group. Someone stopping for a quick coffee before work. A pair of elderly women who came in Tuesday and Thursday mornings without fail and sat at the same table and ordered the same things. The pace dropped from controlled chaos to something manageable, and Victoria felt the room's attention, which had been a physical pressure for the last 40 minutes, finally begin to ease. She went to the back for a water break. The kitchen was narrow and perpetually slightly too warm. Kevin, the cook, was working through the lag between rushes, cleaning the griddle, restocking, the constant maintenance work of a kitchen that never fully stopped. He glanced at her when she came in and then looked back at the griddle. "Word of advice," he said, without looking up. "Don't take it personal. Half those people will tip you better tonight because they feel bad." "Tonight I won't be here," Victoria said. He looked up at that, curious. "Passing through?" "Something like that." He scraped the griddle and didn't push it. In the 2 days she'd been working the early shift, Kevin had asked her exactly nothing personal. She had found this extraordinarily refreshing. She drank the water standing at the small counter beside the prep table. Her reflection looked back at her from the surface of the stainless steel, distorted, elongated, unrecognizable in the way stainless steel reflections always were. Which was fine. She didn't particularly want to recognize herself right now. The problem wasn't the laughter. She needed to be honest with herself about that. The laughter was bad, and the humiliation was real, and the particular feeling of standing in a room while people decided what you were without asking. She wasn't going to pretend that didn't leave a mark. But she had survived worse. She had sat in rooms where men twice her age had explained her own company to her, had watched investors choose less qualified men over her simply because the men were more familiar, had read profiles in business publications that managed to be simultaneously about her success and condescending about the fact of it. She had survived all of that. What she wasn't sure she could survive right now was the kindness. That was the thing she couldn't get her footing on. The tip under the mug. The words he'd said to the room. Plain, without drama, without making himself the center of it. The way he'd looked at her before he spoke, just for a second. A look that wasn't pity, and wasn't attraction, and wasn't calculation. Just, I see what's happening here. She set down the water glass. She had spent the last 4 days in Clover Falls under a name she'd given Frank when she walked in looking for temporary work. Vicky Moran, close enough to feel natural when someone said it, far enough from her real name to buy her the anonymity she needed. She'd come here for 2 reasons that she'd told her assistant, James, and nobody else. First, the Hayes Group was in preliminary talks to acquire a small regional hospitality chain, and 3 of its locations were within 40 miles of Clover Falls. And she'd learned years ago that no amount of financial analysis replaced actually standing in the rooms you were considering buying. Second, and the reason she hadn't put in her official calendar, she needed to not be herself for a few days. Not Victoria Hayes, CEO of the Hayes Group, $3 billion in assets under management, 37 employees in her direct reports chain, 6 ongoing legal matters related to a disputed acquisition, and the small constant hum of being known. She had needed to be nobody for a little while, to move through rooms without rooms rearranging themselves around her presence. Frank had hired her on the spot. He'd looked at her hands, she'd worn no jewelry, had scrubbed her nails clean, and told her she could start the next morning. She'd been mediocre at the job in ways that had surprised her. She was good at people. She'd always been good at people. But serving people in a diner was a physical grammar she didn't quite have yet. The tray balance, the order of operations, the specific choreography of moving through a small space when 6 other people were also moving through it. She'd knocked over a sugar dispenser her first morning. She'd given a table decaf when they'd ordered regular. She'd been fine with the mediocrity. She'd been fine with the soreness and the early hours and the low-grade anonymity of it. She'd been almost enjoying it, in the particular way that hard, simple work was enjoyable when your actual life consisted mostly of being important in abstract ways. And then this morning had happened. She pushed open the swinging door and went back out to the floor. The diner was down to maybe a third capacity now. The construction workers had left. The women with the phones were gone. The family in the corner booth was packing up. The mother bundling the kids into jackets, the father actually helping, which Victoria noted with the dry clinical attention she applied to most human interactions. She started on the cleanup rotation, wiping tables, resetting silverware, refilling the sugar dispensers she'd learned not to knock over. She was at the table near the window when she heard the comment. It came from the counter where 2 men she didn't recognize had come in during her break. Late 50s, both of them. The kind of men who looked like they'd been sitting on bar stools of various descriptions for most of their adult lives. They were talking to each other, but not quietly. The specific volume of people who'd decided their conversation was the room's conversation. "That's the one of them said. "The legs thing." The other one laughed. Not a big laugh. A private laugh. The dismissive kind, the kind that didn't need an audience because it wasn't really a joke, just a confirmation. Victoria kept wiping the table. Her jaw was tight. She could feel it. The specific ache at the hinge point where she'd been clenching without realizing. She had a dentist who had mentioned this twice. She kept forgetting. She kept wiping. "Hey, sweetheart." The first man again. She could feel him looking at her back. "Little advice. Might want to think before you talk next time." She picked up the salt shaker and moved it to the center of the table. Save yourself some embarrassment, he said. She set the condiment caddy back in its spot. She was going to walk away. She was going to walk to the back of the room and pick up the bus tray from the stand near the counter, and she was going to go somewhere else in this diner and do something else. And she was not going to say a single word to this man, because saying something would require acknowledging that what he'd said had any right to land, and she was not going to give him that. That was the plan. She didn't ask for advice. The voice came from 2 stools down the counter. A woman, maybe late 30s, brown coat, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had the tone of someone who said exactly as much as she meant, and not a word more. She hadn't even looked up from her coffee. The man turned toward her. Excuse me? I said she didn't ask for your advice. The woman looked up now, steady. She's doing her job. You're having coffee. Those are the 2 things happening here. A silence. Mind your business, the man said, but the edge in his voice was thinner than he'd probably intended. This is a public counter, the woman said. Everything here is everyone's business. She went back to her coffee. Victoria stood at the table with her hand on the condiment caddy. She was looking at her own hand, the knuckles, the short, unpainted nails, and she became aware that she was very quietly at risk of losing whatever she'd been holding on to for the past hour. She picked up the bus tray. She went to the far end of the room and started clearing the empty tables there, working her way methodically from the window back toward the counter. By the time she reached the middle section, the 2 men at the counter had finished their coffees and were gone. Sandra appeared beside her again. Ignore Ted and his brother, she said. They come in twice a week. They've been like that since high school and nobody's managed to improve them yet. Victoria nodded. She cleared a coffee cup from the table, set it in the tray. The guy from earlier, she said, without quite deciding to say it. The one who... She stopped, started again. Does he come in often? Sandra looked at her. There was something careful in Sandra's eyes. Not suspicious, exactly. More like the look of a woman who was deciding how much to offer. Ethan? Sandra said. Yeah, most mornings. Has been for a couple years. Victoria nodded again, moved the sugar dispenser. He's a good man, Sandra said, and then, apparently deciding that was enough. Not in the dramatic way, just actually. She moved on. Victoria stood at the table she'd been clearing and held a coffee cup and looked at the front door of the diner, the glass still with the slightly crooked open sign, the parking lot visible through it, ordinary and flat and completely unremarkable. A good man, just actually. She set the cup in the bus tray. The thing she kept coming back to, the thing she couldn't quite put down, was how little it had cost him. That was the brutal simplicity of it. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He hadn't risked anything in any meaningful way. He'd stood up in a diner and said a reasonable thing to a room full of people he knew, and then he'd walked out and gone to his job. 15 minutes of his morning, maybe less. And yet she couldn't think of a single person in her actual life, her professional life, her social life, the entire ecosystem of people who knew her name and answered her calls and would describe themselves as people who cared about her, who she was confident would have done the same thing. Not because they were bad people, but because the calculation was different when you knew who she was. When you knew her, you thought about the optics, the angle, the cost-benefit of inserting yourself. You thought about whether it would make her like you more or think you were overstepping. He hadn't thought about any of that. He hadn't known enough to. The morning rush was over. The diner had settled into its mid-morning rhythm, quieter, slower, the kind of hour where conversation carried further because there was less of it. Frank was doing inventory in the back. Kevin had stepped out for 5 minutes. Sandra was at the register. Victoria carried the bus tray to the kitchen, emptied it, brought it back. She was setting up the last empty section when the door opened and a woman came in, 40 maybe, in running clothes, breathing like she'd come straight from a workout. She sat at the counter and put her elbows on the formica and dropped her head into her hands. Victoria brought her water without being asked. The woman looked up, surprised. Oh, thanks. Coffee? Please, black, a lot of it. Victoria poured. She set the mug down and stepped back, and then, because she wasn't sure what she was doing until she was already doing it, she said, Bad morning? The woman laughed, a short, exhausted sound. Bad 3 weeks, she said. But who's counting? Victoria looked at the counter. Hip flexors or lower back? The woman blinked. How did you... the way you sat down. The woman stared at her for a second. Lower back, she said. And honestly, the hip flexors too, I've been overdoing it. A pause. You work out? Used to, Victoria said. More than I should, probably. Sounds familiar. The woman wrapped both hands around the mug. I keep telling myself I'm doing it for my health, and then I wake up and I can't sit down without making a sound. I know that exact sound, Victoria said. The woman laughed again, real this time, less exhausted. She drank her coffee. Victoria went back to her section. She finished wiping down the last table. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at the diner from this angle. The counter, the booths, the window with the crooked sign, the ordinary Tuesday morning carrying on around her. The coffee-stained menus. The chipped sugar dispenser at table 7. The particular quality of light that came through the windows in the late morning, yellow-white and flat, falling across the empty booths in a way that made them look like something from a photograph. She'd been in 1,000 rooms like this. Not this room. Rooms like this. Diners and coffee shops and waiting areas and airports, all the functional, unloved spaces that existed to move people through time without anyone having to feel anything in particular. She'd passed through them her whole adult life without seeing them, because when you were Victoria Hayes, you were never really in them. You were always on your way to somewhere else, somewhere that required you, somewhere with a door that opened when you arrived. She had never been the person wiping the table. She had spent 3 days being that person, and she had learned more in 3 days about what it felt like to be in a room than she'd learned in the previous 3 years of owning things. The thing no one told you, the thing she couldn't have understood from the outside, was how much of how people treated you depended on what they decided you were before you opened your mouth, before you did anything. The moment you walked into a room, something was being decided about you, and you had almost no say in it. Your clothes, your posture, the confidence or lack of it in how you moved, all of it being processed and filed away in the first 4 seconds. After that, every interaction was filtered through the conclusion that had already been reached. She had always known this intellectually. She'd built a career partly on understanding it, on managing her own presentation with the precision of someone who understood they were always being read. She had not understood until this week how exhausting it was to be read wrong. The door opened again. A group of 3, business casual, clearly not from town, the kind of slightly lost-looking confidence of people who were important somewhere else and knew it. Victoria straightened up, smoothed her apron, picked up the menus. "Good morning," she said. "Anywhere you'd like." They chose a booth near the window and barely looked at her when she set the menus down, which was fine. She'd stopped needing people to look at her somewhere around day 2. She pulled her order pad from the apron pocket. Her hip flexor was still screaming. Her lower back had joined in sometime around 9 o'clock. Her feet were doing something she wasn't going to think about yet. She wrote down their orders in her increasingly legible handwriting. It had been illegible day 1, improving, and carried the pad to the kitchen and called out the order and went to get coffee for the woman at the counter, who was on her 3rd cup and finally starting to look like herself. By 10 o'clock, the diner had settled into the quiet that sat between breakfast and lunch. A handful of tables occupied, conversations low, the particular piece of a place between rushes. Victoria was doing the condiment refill rotation, going table to table, checking the ketchup bottles, the hot sauce, the sugar dispensers. When she reached the booth that had been Ethan's, it was clean. Sandra had cleared it thoroughly. New napkins set in the dispenser. The coffee mug rinsed and back in rotation somewhere. Nothing left of him except the booth itself. She stood at it for a moment, just a moment, and then she reached into the condiment caddy and pulled out the salt shaker and turned it over in her hands, checking the cap. A good man. Actually. She screwed the cap back on, set it down. She moved to the next table. He came back the next morning. Victoria was restocking the sugar dispensers at the counter when she heard the bell above the door and looked up out of habit. She'd stopped being able to help it. The bell had rewired some part of her attention over the past 3 days. And there he was. Same flannel, different color, same boots. He looked like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was to say, not particularly. He went straight to his booth. 3rd from the window, left side. He sat down and unwrapped his silverware and looked out at the parking lot the way she'd seen him do yesterday. And for a moment she stood at the counter with a sugar dispenser in each hand and told herself she wasn't going to make this into something it wasn't. Sandra got to him before she had to decide anything. She watched Sandra pour his coffee and say something that made him give a small, tired smile, And then Sandra moved on and he wrapped both hands around the mug and went back to the window. Victoria finished the sugar dispensers. She put them back. She went to check on her tables. The morning was quieter than Tuesday. Wednesday breakfast at Millie's was a different crowd. Fewer construction workers, more older men who came in alone and read newspapers and didn't need much. She moved through her section on autopilot, taking orders, refilling coffee, the physical grammar of the job getting slightly less foreign with each pass. Her hip was better. Not good, but better. She'd taken something for it last night and slept 8 hours in the motel room she'd booked under a different name 3 blocks from the diner, and when she'd woken up she'd been able to stand without negotiating with herself about it, which she was counting as progress. She was at her third table when she realized she was going to go over there. Not because she had a plan, not because she'd thought it through. She was going to go over there because the alternative, spending the rest of the morning aware of exactly where he was sitting and moving carefully around that awareness, seemed like more work than just doing the thing. She grabbed the coffee pot. "More coffee?" she said. He looked up. It took him a half second, the standard beat of someone whose mind was somewhere else being pulled back to the room. Then he registered who was asking. "Sure," he said. She poured. She didn't immediately leave, which she recognized was a choice she was making, and she owned it. "I wanted to say something," she said. "Yesterday." He waited. "What you did?" She stopped. Started the sentence over in her head. Tried again. "You didn't have to do that, and I know saying thank you doesn't really—" She paused. "I just wanted to say it." He looked at her with that same steady quality she'd noticed the day before. Not trying to manage her, not waiting for a chance to speak, just actually listening. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know I don't have to. I wanted to." He nodded once, picked up his mug. "How's the hip?" She blinked. "Better." "Good." He looked back at the window. That, apparently, was going to be the end of it. She stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a coffee refill, and then she moved on to the next table. She was aware of something loosening in her chest. Not dramatic. Not the kind of release that came with crying or yelling or any of the bigger emotional transactions. Just a small easing, the way a knot doesn't untie so much as stop being as tight. She refilled the coffee at table 5. Table 6. Came back around. I was eating his eggs when she passed. She didn't stop. At 8:45, he flagged her down for a check. She brought it over. He looked at it, pulled his wallet out, did the math. "The workout," he said. "What was it?" She looked at him. I was still looking at the check, counting out bills. "Legs," she said, "and some hip work. Circuit training." He nodded like this confirmed something. "I do construction," he said. "Landscaping mostly. Some framing. First couple weeks every spring when we ramp back up. I'm useless for 3 days. Everything hurts." "Does it get easier?" "You stop being surprised by it," he said. "That's about as much as I can promise." He set the money on the table. "Tips in there," he said, in a tone that indicated she should not argue about it. She didn't. She took the check and the money back to the register, and when she looked back at his booth, he was putting on his jacket with the straightforward, unhurried energy of a man who had a full day waiting for him and wasn't dreading it. He lifted a hand, not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement, and then he was out the door. Victoria stood at the register with his money in her hand and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I would like to talk to that man for more than 90 seconds. She put the money in the drawer. She went back to work. The thought sat with her through the rest of the morning. Not urgently. She wasn't 22 anymore, and she'd burned out the part of herself that turned passing thoughts into crises somewhere in her early 30s. But it sat there, patient, waiting to be examined when she had time. She examined it during the lull between 9:30 and 11, while she was folding napkins at the side station and the diner was down to 3 occupied tables. The honest version of the thought was this. In 4 days in Clover Falls, she had spoken to more real people, people who didn't know her, who had no stake in her, who had nothing to gain from the conversation, than she had in the previous 3 months. The woman with the sore back, Kevin's wordless kitchen company, Sandra's dry, efficient kindness. And Ethan, twice now, briefly, in the way of a man who said what he meant and didn't dress it up. She had a life full of conversation, and almost none of it felt like that. She folded another napkin. The corporate version of herself. the one that lived in conference rooms and acquisition negotiations and quarterly reviews, would identify this as a data point. Subject experiences meaningful interaction deficit. Recommend increasing unstructured social contact, filed and actioned and monitored for progress. The human version of herself, standing at a side station in a diner apron with sore legs and 3 days of anonymity, left before James called to tell her the preliminary meeting with the regional chains board had been scheduled. The human version was just tired. Tired of the way the corporate version translated everything. She stacked the napkins. She thought about calling her sister that night. They hadn't talked in 6 weeks, which was both too long and completely normal for them, their relationship having always operated on the rhythm of people who loved each other and had almost nothing in common. Her sister lived in Arizona with her husband and 2 dogs and a job managing a plant nursery, and she asked Victoria approximately once a year whether she was happy and seemed genuinely puzzled by the answer, which was never quite yes or no, but always something complicated and slightly exhausting to explain. She thought about calling her, then thought she probably wouldn't. Lunch came and went, a different crowd, younger, faster, the midday energy distinct from morning. She moved through it with more confidence than she'd had Monday, the body finally starting to learn the room. At 2 o'clock, Frank told her she could cut out. He said it the way he said most things. Not unkindly, not warmly, just factually, the way a man running a diner on thin margins communicated with the staff. He wasn't sure he was keeping. She untied the apron in the back, changed her shoes, put on the jacket she'd left on the hook by the service entrance. She stepped outside into the afternoon air, which was cool and smelled like cut grass from somewhere nearby, and stood on the sidewalk and did not immediately take out her phone, which was an act of discipline she was still having to consciously perform. She walked. Not anywhere specific. Clover Falls was small enough that walking without a destination wasn't a problem. You ran out of town before you ran out of willingness. She went down Main Street, past the hardware store and the pharmacy and the small insurance office with a hand-lettered sign in the window, past a barber shop where 2 older men were talking in the doorway, past the park, which had a fountain that wasn't running and benches that were. She sat on a bench. She took her phone out, finally, and looked at the notifications with the detached attention of someone reviewing a document about someone else's life. 11 emails marked urgent by her assistant's color-coding system. 4 texts from people on her executive team. A calendar reminder about the preliminary board meeting, now 2 days out. She put the phone away. She looked at the fountain that wasn't running. There was a crack along the basin's edge, the kind that happened slowly, over years, until one day the water just stopped holding. Someone had done a patch job on it. Rough, visible, effective enough. The fountain wasn't pretty, but it was still standing. She thought about the diner, about what she'd come here to learn. The hospitality chain she was considering acquiring. Meridian Rest, 8 locations across 4 states, mid-market positioning, consistent revenue but flat growth. Looked excellent on paper. The financials were clean. The brand had good regional recognition. The locations were strategic. Her team's analysis had been thorough and positive. But financial analysis didn't tell you what it felt like to walk into one of the properties. It didn't tell you what the staff dynamic was. Whether the service had warmth or just efficiency, whether the rooms felt like someone cared about them or like someone had checked a box. She had 2 of Meridian's locations on her visit list for tomorrow and Friday. She'd been planning to walk through them as herself. Victoria Hayes, potential acquirer, receiving the full attention tour. Frank's Diner had reminded her what you missed when rooms rearranged themselves around your presence. She was reconsidering the approach. She was reconsidering a number of things. The next morning, Thursday, Ethan was in his booth again. She didn't make a thing of it. She brought coffee without being asked. She'd noticed he never had to ask for the first cup, that Frank's staff simply brought it when he sat down, and she'd filed that away. And set it down and was starting to move on when he said, "Sit down for a second." She looked at him. "If you're not in the middle of something," he said, "I wanted to ask you something." She glanced at her section. 2 occupied tables, both settled with food and coffee. She sat across from him. He turned the mug in his hands. He had the look of a man who'd been thinking about something and had decided, sometime between whatever yesterday had been for him and right now, that he was going to say it. "You're not actually from here," he said. Not accusatory, just stating it. "No," she said, passing through. "Yes." He nodded, drank his coffee. "That's fine," he said. "I'm not asking where from." He paused. I'm asking if you're okay. She looked at him across the table. The diner was doing its morning thing around them. The griddle, the low conversation, Sandra moving through her section, the ordinary world carrying on. Why? She said. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for the easy answer. Because Tuesday was a rough morning, he said, and yesterday you seemed like someone holding a lot of things very carefully, and I've been that person enough times to recognize it. She sat with that for a moment. I'm okay, she said. Then, I've been better. Yeah. He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. The city thing wearing on you or something more specific? Both, she said before she could weigh it. Something specific that made the city thing obvious. He seemed to understand that, which surprised her. He didn't ask what the specific thing was. He just said, How long you been carrying it? The specific thing? About 6 weeks? She looked at the table. The city thing. Longer. I don't know exactly when it started. Those are different problems, he said. I know. The specific thing is easier, he said. Or it feels harder because it's recent, but it has edges. You can work on something with edges, he paused. The other kind is worse because you can't point to it. She looked up at him. You sound like you've thought about this. I've had a lot of early mornings, he said. A pause opened up between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that existed when two people were deciding simultaneously how much to say next. Single dad? She said. How'd you know? Sandra mentioned it, and you have dried marker on your left cuff. He looked at his cuff. A faint streak of green. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Lily, she's 6. Yesterday it was the bathroom mirror. What was she drawing on the mirror? She claims it was a horse, he said. I'm taking her word for it. Victoria smiled. It happened before she decided to let it. How long have you been doing it alone? 3 years, he said. Since she was 3. He said it the way people said the practical facts of hard things. Without drama, but not without weight. Her mom's not... She's not in the picture. By her own choice. It took me about a year to stop being angry about that, and about another year to stop being sad about it. He turned the mug again. Now it's just how things are. Does Lily ask about her? Sometimes. I answer what I can. The rest I tell her she can ask again when she's older. He paused. I don't know if that's the right approach. I've read 3 different books about it, and they all say something different. I think the fact that you read 3 books probably matters more than which one was right, Victoria said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically. Just a small recalibration, the look of someone who'd said something honest and had it received honestly. Maybe, he said. Sandra appeared with the coffee pot, topped them both off without comment, and disappeared. Victoria hadn't even noticed her section. She made a mental note to check it in 60 seconds. What do you do? Ethan asked. When you're not passing through? The question sat in front of her like an object she had to pick up and examine before she could decide what to do with it. She had a standard answer. She'd used it 3 or 4 times this week when Frank or Kevin or the Tuesday morning running woman had asked adjacent questions. Business consulting. Freelance. Flexible schedule. All technically accurate in the loosest sense. She looked at him. I run a company, she said. He nodded. What kind? Acquisitions mostly. Hotels, hospitality properties. We buy things, restructure them, run them. Is it... He stopped, chose the word. Do you like it? I'm very good at it. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes. He wasn't being aggressive. He wasn't making a point. He was just asking, with the straightforward curiosity of someone who didn't have a stake in the answer. I used to, she said. I don't know what I am about it now. It got big in a way I didn't anticipate, and somewhere in getting big it stopped. She searched for the word. It stopped feeling like mine. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's an honest answer. I'm practicing, she said. And then, because that had come out sounding more pointed than she meant, I'm not very good at saying what I actually think, to people who aren't on my payroll. Why not? Because what I actually think is usually inconvenient, she said, for someone. He seemed to sit with that. Outside the window, a car pulled into the lot, and 2 people got out, moving with the urgency of people late for something. The door opened. The bell rang. Victoria registered it, registered that Sandra would get the door, registered that her section was still quiet. Lily said something last week, Ethan said. He was looking at the table, the way people looked at things when they were actually looking inward. She was upset because a girl at school told her that her drawing wasn't as good as someone else's, and she came home and said, "Dad, what's the point of drawing if someone else is better?" He paused. I didn't have a great answer. I said something about how we don't draw to be better than someone else. We draw because we like it, which is true, but it felt insufficient. What would the sufficient answer have been? I don't know, he said. That's why it's been on my mind. Victoria looked at the table, at her own hands, which she'd folded in front of her in a posture she recognized as the one she used in negotiations, which meant some part of her was defaulting to a professional mode she hadn't consciously chosen. She unfolded her hands. Maybe the sufficient answer is the one you figure out together, she said. Over time, over more conversations about it. She looked at him. She's 6. She's got years of asking that question in different forms. You've got time to work on the answer. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. They sat in a silence that had a different quality than the one before, something slightly warmer. The kind of silence that happened between people who'd said something true at each other and were just letting it settle. She checked her section, still quiet. She should get up. She knew she should get up. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Tuesday, she said, when you stood up. What made you... She stopped. You could have just left. He thought about it. Not quickly. She'd noticed this about him. He didn't rush answers, didn't grab the first thing that was available. He turned things over. I've been the person in the room that everyone's decided something about, he said. Single dad, young, not a lot of money. People have a lot of opinions about what your situation means about your character. Most of the time they don't ask. They just decide. He paused. And I've sat in rooms where I wanted someone to say something and nobody did. So... He shrugged. Not dismissively. More like the shrug of someone who'd reduced a complicated thing to its simplest form. I figured I knew what that felt like. Victoria looked at him. She had a speech she gave sometimes, at conferences, at industry events, the kind of speech that people called inspiring and shared clips of on social media. It was about resilience and about building things from nothing, and about the importance of being underestimated. It was a good speech. She'd given it 14 times. It was completely true and had almost nothing to do with how any of it had actually felt. What Ethan had just said in 40-odd words was closer to the real thing than anything in the speech. She didn't say that. She just said, "Thank you for answering." Sure. He finished his coffee. The check was already on the tables. Sandra had left it sometime in the last few minutes without Victoria noticing. He opened his wallet. You going to be here tomorrow? He asked, and then, as if clarifying, just asking, you mentioned passing through. One more day, she said. Maybe 2. He nodded. Put money on the table. She didn't look at the tip, she'd given up looking, and stood up and pulled on his jacket. The horse on the mirror, Victoria said. He paused, jacket half on. Tell her it's good, she said. Not because it is or it isn't, just because she made something and put it somewhere. That takes more than people think. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. I'll tell her, he said. He picked up his jacket the rest of the way. He went to the door. The bell rang. Victoria sat in his booth for another 30 seconds. She'd take the 20-second penalty from Frank. It was fine. And looked at the table. The empty mug. The absent plate. The ordinary geography of a booth in a small-town diner on a Thursday morning. She got up. She got the coffee pot. She went back to work. Her phone was in her apron pocket, and it had buzzed twice in the last 20 minutes, and she hadn't looked at it. And she was aware that this was a small thing, and aware also that 3 weeks ago she would not have been capable of it. She refilled the coffee at table 7. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. She visited the First Meridian property on Thursday afternoon. It was 40 minutes outside Clover Falls on a state highway that ran through flat farmland, and then through the kind of small commercial corridor that existed in every mid-sized town. The same fast food signs, the same strip mall configurations, the same particular quality of aspiration that hadn't quite become anything yet. The Meridian Rest sat at the end of a service road off the main highway, 8 stories of beige exterior and a lobby that had been renovated recently enough to look intentional, but not recently enough to look good. Victoria walked in wearing the same jeans and jacket she'd worn all week. No assistant, no advance notice to the property manager. She'd booked a room online the night before under the name V. Moran and paid with a card that didn't say Hayes Group on it. The front desk clerk was maybe 23. He checked her in with the particular energy of someone in the third hour of a long shift. Not rude, not warm, just present in the minimal way that got the transaction done. She noticed the way he looked past her shoulder while she signed the registration form, tracking the lobby rather than engaging with the guest in front of him. She noticed the carpet in the hallway to the elevator had a seam coming up near the far wall. She noticed the elevator had a smell that the service log on the inside wall hadn't been updated in 11 days. She spent 3 hours in the property. She walked every floor. She ate in the restaurant. Mediocre risotto, bread that had been sitting too long, a server who was attentive but visibly overwhelmed. She sat in the small business center off the lobby and watched 2 guests try to use the printer and fail and eventually give up and leave. She talked to a housekeeper in the 4th floor hallway who didn't know who she was and told her, in the specific unguarded way of someone who'd stopped expecting management to listen, that the supply closets were always understocked on Fridays and weekends, and could she please pass that on to someone? Victoria wrote it in the Notes app on her phone. She drove back to Clover Falls in the early dark, the farmland turning gray on either side of the highway, the lights of the town coming up ahead like something small and deliberate. She sat in her motel room that night with the Meridian financials open on her laptop and her notes from the property visit beside them, and worked until 11. The financials were still clean. The property was still underperforming its potential in ways that were structurally fixable: staffing ratios, supply chain, front desk training, about $40,000 in deferred maintenance she could see just from the walkthrough. The bones were sound. The problems were the kind you solved with attention and money, and the willingness to stay in the details long enough to understand them. She'd solved that kind before. Many times. She was good at it. She closed the laptop at 11:15 and lay on the motel bed and stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain in one corner shaped vaguely like the state of Nebraska. The housekeeper's voice stayed with her. The supply closets are always understocked on Fridays and weekends. Could you pass that on to someone? She'd said it without bitterness. That was the thing, just as a fact. The way you stated facts about systems you'd long ago accepted weren't going to change because nobody with the power to change them was ever in the right place to hear about them. Victoria had been that nobody for a long time and hadn't known it. She fell asleep with the light on. Friday morning was cold. The kind of cold that arrived without warning in late spring and reminded you that the season wasn't finished proving itself. She walked to the diner with her hands in her jacket pockets and her breath visible, and the main street of Clover Falls in the early morning had a quality she hadn't noticed before, something spare and honest, the storefronts still dark, the sidewalks empty, the town in the brief daily interval when it was just itself without anyone watching. She'd called her sister last night, after the laptop, before the ceiling, 22 minutes, which was long for them. Her sister had asked the annual question, "Are you happy?" And Victoria had said, "I don't know, but I think I'm closer to figuring out what the question actually means." And there'd been a pause, and then her sister had said, "Well, that's something," and Victoria had said, "Yeah," and they'd talked about the dogs for 5 minutes and hung up. It had been, she realized walking to the diner in the cold, one of the better phone calls they'd had in years. She pushed open the door. The bell. The warmth and the griddle smell and the particular sound of Millie's on a Friday morning, which had its own character, looser than Tuesday, more forgiving. She tied on the apron. Sandra was already running her section. Kevin gave Victoria a nod from the kitchen window that she'd come to understand meant, "Good morning, and also, please don't knock anything over near my prep station." She'd stopped knocking things over near his prep station on day 3. At 7:58, the bell rang and Ethan came in. She was aware of it. She was always aware of it now. The bell, the door, the third booth from the window. And she noted it and kept moving. She had tables. He ordered what he always ordered. Sandra brought the coffee. He looked out the window at the parking lot. The difference today was the jacket on the seat across from him. Not his jacket. His was on, and it was a different color. This was a small jacket, bright yellow, the kind made for a child of about 6. It was sitting on the bench seat across from him, folded neatly in the way that things got folded when someone was trying to be careful and was not quite tall enough to do it perfectly. Victoria was at the counter when she noticed it. She looked at the jacket and then at Ethan and put together what she hadn't put together before. He wasn't alone this morning. She found Lily in the restroom hallway 2 minutes later. The girl was at the water fountain, which was slightly too tall for her whole body angled upward to reach the arc of water. She had dark hair in 2 braids, not perfectly even, but close. And she was wearing a purple sweater with a small paint stain near the left cuff that matched the green marker on Ethan's sleeve in some essential way, a symmetry of small accidents. She got her water. She turned around and found Victoria standing there and looked at her with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old, which was the most honest kind of attention there was. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi," Victoria said. "School's out today?" "Teacher planning day," Lily said. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve. "Dad said I could come if I was good. I've been good." A pause, clarifying. "So far." Victoria smiled. "That's the right approach." Lily looked at her with the considering expression of someone taking this assessment seriously. "Are you the new lady?" "I am." "Sandra said you're passing through." "That's right." Lily thought about this. "Where are you going?" "Back home." "Where's home?" "Far from here," Victoria said. "A city." Lily wrinkled her nose in the way that children expressed opinions they hadn't been asked for. "Cities are loud," she said. "They are," Victoria agreed. "Dad took me to the city once. I didn't like the smell." "Which city?" "I don't remember. The big one." She looked past Victoria toward the diner, oriented toward food in the way of a child who had been told to be good and had been, and was now ready to be compensated. "Are you going to bring our food?" "I might," Victoria said. "What did you order?" "Pancakes." A pause. "With the little faces. Sandra knows how to make the eyes." "I'll check on that." Lily went back to the booth with the serious walk of a child on a mission. Victoria went to the kitchen and checked on the pancakes. She brought them out herself. Frank gave her a look. It wasn't technically her table, and she carried the look and the plate out to the booth. Lily was sitting across from Ethan with a crayon set she'd produced from somewhere. A jacket pocket, apparently, the yellow jacket now on, already serving as a supply cabinet, and a placemat she'd turned over to draw on. She was deep in the project when Victoria set the plate down and looked up with an expression of pure, unself-conscious joy at the sight of the smiley-face pancakes that made something in Victoria's chest do a complicated thing. "Sandra makes the eyebrows go like this," Lily said, demonstrating a disgruntled eyebrow angle with her own face. "I see that," Victoria said. "This one looks worried," Lily said, pointing at the left pancake. "Eat the worried one first," Ethan said. "Put it out of its misery." Lily considered this with great seriousness and then cut into it. Ethan looked up at Victoria. There was something different in his expression today, less contained than Thursday, less like a man carefully managing his own reserves. She thought it might be Lily's effect on him. The loosening that happened when the person you loved most was right in front of you and not needing anything except pancakes. "Sit," he said. She glanced at her section. Quiet. She sat. Lily was drawing on the back of the placemat between bites. A large animal of some kind, 4 legs, an ambitious mane. "That's the horse," she told Victoria, without looking up. "From the mirror." "Dad told you he told me about that?" "He tells me most things," Lily said matter-of-factly. A bite of pancake. "He said you said it was good that I made it." "I did say that." Lily looked up then, briefly, with an expression that was weighing whether this was true or the kind of thing adults said to be nice. She had clearly encountered both and was developing her detection system. "Even though it looked bad?" "I haven't seen it," Victoria said. "But I think something can be good even if it doesn't look the way you meant it to. Because you were trying to make something real. That part is good." Lily turned this over. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way of children who were actually processing something rather than waiting for their turn to talk. Then she went back to drawing. Ethan was watching his daughter. The expression on his face was the one Victoria had no word for. Something that lived between pride and exhaustion and a kind of fierce, helpless love that he probably thought he was keeping off his face. It wasn't, but it was the right kind of thing to let show. "She asked me about the horse drawing last night," he said. "We talked about it for 20 minutes. What did you figure out?" That she wants to take an art class. He rubbed the back of his neck. Which is fine. It's just, there aren't many options around here for 6-year-olds. The community center has a thing on Saturday mornings, but it starts at 8, and I usually have site visits on Saturdays. Could you shift the site visits? Some of them, not all. He picked up his coffee. I'll figure it out. He said it the way he said most things about the practical difficulties of his life. Not as a complaint, not as an invitation for solutions, just as a statement of current fact that he was already in the process of addressing. She had noticed this about him over 5 mornings. He did not perform his problems. He had them, and worked on them, and got up the next day and worked on them again. She had known people who ran companies smaller than his problems, and made more noise about it. I'm leaving tomorrow, she said. He nodded, like he'd been expecting it. Early? Probably 8 or so. I have a meeting in the afternoon I pushed twice already. Important meeting? It decides whether I buy something I've been thinking about buying for 6 months. She looked at the table. I've been thinking about it differently this week. He waited. The thing I'm buying, it's a chain of hotels. The financials made sense. I visited the property yesterday. She paused. It was fine. It was a fine property with fixable problems, which is what I buy. But I went in as a guest instead of as myself. And what I saw, she stopped, reorganized. There's a housekeeper on the 4th floor who told me the supply closets are always understocked on weekends. She said it like she'd been saying it to people for years and nothing had changed. And the front desk clerk was checking me in and he was already looking past me, already half somewhere else. Ethan looked at her steadily. The money is fine, she said. The structure is fixable. But I don't know how to put this without it sounding abstract. The feeling of it. The way it felt to be a person moving through that property. She looked up. I've bought and restructured 11 properties. I've looked at hundreds. And I've never walked a floor as someone who could actually feel whether the place made people feel seen or not. And it didn't, he said. Not even close. He was quiet for a moment. Lily had finished the worried pancake and was working on the second, less emotionally compromised one, and was narrating something quietly to herself about the horse drawing that neither of them was listening to closely. Is that a reason not to buy it? Ethan said. I don't know, Victoria said. It might be a reason to buy it and do it right. Or it might be a reason to ask whether I'm the right person to do it right. She paused. I've been asking that question about some things this week. Whether you're the right person, whether I've been doing things the right way, whether I've been paying attention to the right things. She looked at her hands on the table. I have a lot of answers, and I'm not sure they're all the right questions. He looked at her, that steady, not trying to manage anything look, and said, What do you want the work to feel like? She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was right there, immediate and slightly uncomfortable in its clarity, like something that had been in a locked room for a long time and had been waiting for someone to ask the right question to open the door. I want to walk into something I'm building and have it feel the way this diner feels at 8 in the morning, she said, which I know sounds... It doesn't sound anything, he said. It sounds like you know what you want. She looked at him. You just said it, he said. That's not nothing. She sat with that for a moment. Lily had abandoned the second pancake temporarily in favor of adding what appeared to be a very elaborate background to the horse drawing. Trees, possibly mountains, something that might have been a sun or might have been an explosion. It was hard to tell, and the ambiguity felt intentional. I found something out about you, Victoria said. Yesterday, from Sandra. He raised an eyebrow. She told me you've been coming in here for 2 years. Every morning, same booth. And she said you tipped double for the first 6 months after you started coming in, before you even knew anyone's name, just because, I'm quoting here, because the coffee was always right and someone deserves to be recognized for getting something right every day. He looked mildly embarrassed. Sandra talks too much. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, Victoria said. She said it like everyone should know that about you. He was quiet. I run a company that's theoretically in the business of hospitality, she said. I have been for 9 years. And I don't think I have ever once thought to tip someone double just because they got something right every day. She looked at him. That's not an indictment of myself. I'm just noting it. You're noting it because you're going to change it, he said. She blinked. How do you know that? Because you keep saying things like you're building a case, he said. You're not telling me about the housekeeper or the double tip because you want to vent. You're telling me because you're working something out. She stared at him. Am I wrong? He said. No, she said quietly. He picked up his coffee. Then you don't need me to tell you what to do. You're already doing it. Lily looked up from her drawing. She pointed at Victoria with her crayon. Are you sad? She asked. Both adults looked at her. You look like when Dad thinks about hard things, Lily said. His face goes like this. She made an expression of concentrated effort that was a surprisingly accurate impression of Ethan's thinking face. I look like that? Ethan said. All the time, Lily said cheerfully. She went back to the drawing. Victoria laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A real laugh, the kind that happened when something genuinely surprised you, warm and slightly embarrassing in its honesty. Ethan was smiling. Not the small, contained expression she'd seen most of the week. An actual smile, reaching places in his face that the other hadn't. It changed him, made him look younger, or maybe just more like himself. She does that, he said, just walks right into it. It's a gift, Victoria said. It's terrifying, he said, but yeah. She looked at the time on the wall clock. She had the second Meridian property visit at 1 o'clock, 40 miles south, and she needed to go back to the motel first and review the documentation her team had sent overnight. She should get up. She knew she should get up. She reached into her apron pocket. She had a business card in there. She'd put it there this morning without quite deciding to, the way you carried things on the chance they'd be needed. It had her real name on it, her real title, her direct number that 12 people in the world had, and all of them were either family or had signed an NDA. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it. She watched him read it, watched the small, controlled recalibration that moved through his expression, not shock exactly, more like the look of someone who'd suspected something and was now seeing it confirmed, and was deciding what to do with the confirmation. It was quiet for a moment. Victoria Hayes, he said. Not a question. Just her name, said plainly. Yes, she said. Another beat. You've been working in a diner, he said. I need to see something the other way around, she said. I've been trying to understand something about hospitality that you can't understand from the buying side. A pause. And I needed to be nobody for a few days. He looked at the card again, then at her. Does it change anything? She said. About, she gestured between them, at the table, at the week. This. He thought about it. She watched him think about it, the real consideration, not the performed kind. And she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was slightly nervous about the answer, which was not a feeling she associated with herself, generally. Nervous was not something Victoria Hayes had time for. No, he said. It doesn't change anything. She let out a breath. It explains some things, he said. The way you talked about the property. The way you've been watching this place all week. He paused. I thought maybe hospitality consulting. I wasn't entirely far off. You're not far off, she said. Lily had finished the drawing and was now holding it up for assessment. The horse was magnificent in its wrongness. 8 legs, a mane that covered most of the body, standing in front of mountains that were taller than physically possible. The explosion or sun had turned out to be a flower. What do you think? Lily asked Victoria. Victoria looked at it for a real moment. Not the half-second adults usually gave children's drawings before saying something encouraging. She actually looked at it. The flower is the best part, she said. You made it bigger than everything else. That means you knew what mattered. Lily looked at the drawing, looked back at Victoria. She seemed satisfied in the deep, uncomplicated way of someone who had been told a true thing. She folded the drawing carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, in with the crayons. Ethan was watching Victoria. The card was still on the table between them. I have to go check on my section, she said. She started to slide out of the booth. Hey, he said. She stopped. He picked up the card, held it for a moment. The second property, he said. The one you're visiting this afternoon. What about it? Walk the kitchen, he said. Not just the rooms. Walk the kitchen and find whoever's been there the longest and ask them what they'd fix first. He paused. You'll know more in 10 minutes than the whole financial report. She looked at him. That's what I do when I take on a new site, he said. Find the person who's been there the longest and ask them what's wrong. They always know. They've always known. Nobody's ever asked. She thought about the housekeeper on the fourth floor. The supply closets, always understocked on weekends. You do landscaping, she said. Same principle, he said. People who do the work know what the work needs. He set the card down on the table and slid it toward her. You don't need to leave that. She looked at the card. I know who you are, he said simply. You don't have to give me credentials. She picked up the card. She put it back in the apron pocket. She got out of the booth. She went back to her section. She checked her tables, refilled coffee, smiled at a man who was struggling with the laminated menu as if it had wronged him personally. She walked past Ethan's booth twice more in the next 20 minutes. The second time, Lily was showing him the drawing again, pointing at the flower and explaining something at length. Ethan was listening with his full attention. No phone, no window, no elsewhere. Just his daughter and the impossible horse and the flower that was bigger than everything. At 9:15, he paid his check and they left together. Lily went first, walking with the purposeful energy of a child who had been good and was now free. Ethan followed, pausing at the door to hold it for an older man coming in. The bell rang. The door closed. Victoria was at the counter. She watched the parking lot through the window. Lily running ahead to the truck, Ethan following at his steady, unhurried pace. He said something to Lily, and she turned around and laughed and kept running. Sandra appeared at Victoria's shoulder. She looked out the window too for a moment. Good man, Sandra said, same words as before, same tone. I know, Victoria said. Sandra moved on. Victoria stood at the counter for a moment longer, looking at the parking lot, the truck pulling out, the ordinary Friday morning of Clover Falls continuing around her. Then she went to check on table 4. She had a property to visit this afternoon. She had a meeting to prepare for. She had a company that was waiting for her, and a decision that needed to be made, and a housekeeper on a 4th floor who had been saying the same thing for years to people who weren't listening. She had work to do. She picked up the coffee pot. She visited the Second Meridian property that afternoon and did exactly what Ethan had said. She walked to the kitchen first. The property was larger than the first, 10 stories, a conference wing, a restaurant that tried harder than it should have and landed somewhere between ambitious and confused. She checked in as V. Moran, same as before, and spent 20 minutes in the room before going back downstairs with the practiced casualness of a guest, looking for the ice machine. The kitchen entrance was off a service corridor behind the restaurant. She stood near the door for a moment and watched, not hiding, just not announcing herself, and saw what she needed to see in about 4 minutes. The line cook nearest the pass was doing the work of 2 people. The expediter was calling tickets to nobody in particular because the second prep cook had disappeared somewhere. The floor manager kept coming in and out of the kitchen to check on the dining room, which meant nobody was managing the kitchen, which meant the line cook near the pass had quietly become the person holding everything together through sheer stubbornness. She found the dishwasher near the back. His name tag said Carl, and he moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been in this kitchen for a long time and had long ago made his peace with it. She asked him, in the way of a mildly curious guest who'd wandered somewhere she probably shouldn't be, how long he'd worked there. 7 years, he said. He didn't seem bothered by her presence. He'd probably seen stranger things. What would you fix first? She said. He looked at her. A beat of assessment. Not suspicious, just measuring whether this was worth answering honestly. Something in her face apparently settled it. The scheduling, he said. Weekend nights, we're always 2 people short. Has been that way for 2 years. Manager says it's a budget thing, but the real thing is nobody wants to work weekends for what they're offering. He rinsed a tray. Fix the pay on weekend shifts, you fix the staffing. Fix the staffing, you fix the kitchen. Fix the kitchen, you fix the whole back half of the operation. He set the tray in the rack. But nobody's asked me that before. Thank you, Carl, she said. He nodded and went back to the dishes. She walked the rest of the property. She talked to a front desk clerk who'd been there 3 years and had opinions about the check-in software that were specific and correct. She talked to a housekeeper named Denise, who told her, without any particular emotion, that the laundry facility in the basement flooded slightly every time it rained hard, and maintenance had been notified 7 times. 7 times. She wrote it all down. She drove back to Clover Falls in the dark and ate a sandwich from the gas station 2 blocks from the motel because she'd forgotten to eat a real meal and her body had started issuing formal complaints. She sat on the edge of the motel bed with the sandwich and her laptop and her notes and looked at everything she'd collected over the past 5 days and understood, with the particular clarity that came from being tired and far from her normal context, what she was going to do. She was going to buy Meridian Rest. Not because the financials were clean, though they were. Not because the locations were strategic, though they were. But because Carl had been washing dishes for 7 years and knew exactly what was wrong with the operation and had never been asked, and somewhere in the 7 regional properties of this company, there were dozens of Carls and Denises and fourth-floor housekeepers with specific, accurate knowledge about exactly what needed fixing, and nobody had ever walked in and actually listened. She was going to buy it, and she was going to do it right. Not in the way she'd done the previous 11 acquisitions, competent, efficient, effective, and conducted almost entirely from a remove that she'd always told herself was strategic objectivity, but which this week had revealed itself to be, at least partly, a way of never having to feel the friction of the actual thing. She was going to walk the kitchens herself. She was going to ask the people who'd been there the longest what they'd fix first. She was going to sit in the lobbies at 8 in the morning and watch what happened when ordinary people moved through an ordinary day in places she was responsible for. She ate the rest of the sandwich. She closed the laptop. She thought about the diner, about what made it work, in the plain, structural way of someone trying to understand a thing she could use. It wasn't the coffee, which was fine, but not exceptional. It wasn't the food, which was reliable but not remarkable. It wasn't even Sandra's particular brand of efficient warmth, though that was part of it. It was that when you walked into Millie's Corner Diner, someone knew how you took your coffee before you sat down. That was it. That was the whole thing. After 2 visits, you were known. Not in a showy way. Not in the way of places that made a performance of remembering your name. Just known. In the quiet, functional way of a place that was paying attention. She had spent 9 years buying properties and restructuring them, and had never once described what she was building as a place that was paying attention. She was going to fix that. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and thought about Ethan, the way you thought about things you weren't ready to make decisions about, carefully, at a slight distance, examining them for what they were, rather than what you wanted them to be. He was a single father in a small town who worked with his hands and had coffee every morning in the same booth and left good tips because he thought the people who got things right every day deserved to be recognized for it. He was someone who stood up in rooms and said plain things when plain things needed to be said. I was someone whose 6-year-old daughter drew 8-legged horses on mirrors and folded the pictures carefully into her jacket pocket, and he was building her into someone who understood that what mattered was the making of things, not the perfection of them. He was not part of her world. She knew that. Not in the practical sense of geography and circumstance and the entire architecture of her life, which existed 300 miles from here, in a city that did not know what to do with people who moved at the pace of a Tuesday morning in Clover Falls. But he had done something to the way she saw things, and she didn't think that was going to undo itself when she left. She wasn't sure she wanted it to. She woke at 6, earlier than she'd set the alarm, and lay in the gray morning light listening to the town come awake through the thin walls of the motel. A car in the parking lot. Someone's alarm clock in the next room, silenced quickly. A bird that hadn't gotten the memo about the cold. She showered. She packed, which didn't take long. She'd traveled deliberately light this week, a discipline that had felt significant at the time and now just felt practical. She put the apron in the bag Frank had given her to take home, which he'd done on Thursday, with the specific awkwardness of a man extending a kindness he couldn't quite frame without making it weird. She'd taken it without making it weird. She walked to the diner at 7:45. It was her last morning. She'd told Frank Thursday night. He'd given her a check for 4 days' work. She'd worked half days, and she'd folded it without looking at the amount and put it in her pocket. She had no idea what to do with it except deposit it somewhere and have the number sit in her account reminding her of something she was going to work to not forget. The diner was warm, the bell, the griddle, Sandra already moving through her section with the coffee pot, the particular Tuesday morning energy translating on a Friday into something slightly more relaxed. Kevin handed her a coffee over the counter pass without being asked when she came through the back. She took it and drank it standing up in the kitchen, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and it was, she thought, one of the better cups of coffee she'd had all week. She tied on the apron for the last time. At 7:58, the bell rang. She was in her section and couldn't see the door from where she was standing, but she knew. She'd been unreasonably attuned to that bell all week, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself. She finished with table 2 and came around. He was in the booth. Same jacket, the darker flannel. Coffee already in front of him. Sandra had gotten there first, as usual. And he was doing the thing with the parking lot, looking out the window with the private, slightly unfocused gaze of a man spending 45 seconds that belonged entirely to him. He looked up when she approached. "Last day," he said. "Last day," she confirmed. She sat down across from him without being asked, which was different from every other morning except Thursday, and he didn't seem surprised. "How was the second property?" he said. "Better than the first, worse than it should be." She put both hands around her coffee mug. "I talked to the dishwasher." Something moved in his expression. "And?" "7 years," she said. "Weekend scheduling. Exactly what you said." He nodded. "I'm going to buy it," she said. "Both properties. The chain." She looked at him. "I'm going to do it the way it should have been done the first time I bought something." "What's the difference?" "I'm going to actually be in it," she said. "Not from a remove. I'm going to walk the kitchens and talk to the Carls." A pause. "I've been managing things from a distance for so long that I stopped understanding what the distance was costing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What changed?" She looked at him steadily. "I got laughed at in a diner." He made a sound, a small exhale through the nose that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that family. "That'll do it," he said. "And then someone stood up," she said, "and I couldn't figure out why it mattered so much. I spent 2 days turning it over." She paused. "I think I figured out why." He waited. "Nobody has done anything for me without a reason in a very long time," she said. "Not a bad reason, necessarily, but a reason. There's always a calculation. I stopped expecting there not to be." She looked at the table. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't have a reason. You just—" She stopped. "You just thought it was the right thing." "It was the right thing," he said simply. "I know," "No," she said. "That's the part I keep coming back to." She looked up. "I've built a company on understanding people's motivations, on reading rooms and understanding what people want and using that. And I'd gotten so good at it that I stopped believing rooms could work any other way." He considered that. "That sounds lonely," he said. The word landed cleanly. She hadn't expected it to be that specific. "It is," she said. "I didn't know how lonely until this week." The diner was filling up around them. Sandra moved through her section with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made a professional art form of not interrupting conversations that were saying something. Kevin called a ticket number through the pass. Someone at the counter laughed at something. "I want to ask you something," Victoria said. "And I want you to answer it the way you answer things. Not the way people answer things when they think I'm important." He looked at her. "Okay." "When you stood up on Tuesday," she said, "you said you'd been in rooms where you wanted someone to say something and nobody did. What room were you thinking of?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he looked out the window. "3 years ago," he said, "when Maya, Lily's mom, when she left. It was—" He stopped, organized it. It wasn't a sudden thing. It had been falling apart for a year, but when it finally happened, everyone in town knew. Small town. Everyone knows everything. He paused. "And for about 6 months after, I would take Lily to the park, or the grocery store, or whatever, and I could feel people deciding things. About me. About what must have happened, what I must have done, why a mother would leave her 3-year-old. He looked at the table. "And nobody ever just said, 'That's hard, and it's not your fault, and you're doing okay.' Nobody. Because they didn't know what happened, and they were being careful not to assume, which I understand. But careful looked exactly like silence." Victoria was very still. "And one morning I came in here," he said, 6 months after. I was not in a good place. Lily was sick, I hadn't slept. I'd just gotten a call that a project I needed had fallen through. And Sandra brought my coffee, and she looked at me and said," he paused. "She said, 'You look like you're carrying the whole thing by yourself. You don't have to do that forever.' And then she went to the next table." He picked up his mug. "That's all she said. 9 words, maybe. And it was It was enough. It didn't fix anything, but it was enough. He set the mug down. That's what I was thinking about on Tuesday, about what it costs someone to say a thing, and what it costs the person to not hear it. Victoria looked at him. She had been in rooms with some of the sharpest people in American business. She had heard speeches designed and tested and delivered by people whose entire professional existence depended on the precise management of language. She had read books about communication and human psychology and the architecture of influence. She had never heard anything that sounded as true as what Ethan Brooks had just said in a booth in a small-town diner on a Friday morning. Sandra knows, she said quietly. Sandra's been watching people in this room for 20 years, he said. She knows more about how people work than most people I've met. Victoria nodded. She thought about the Meridian properties, the front desk clerk looking past her shoulder, the manager coming in and out of the kitchen, the whole operation running on the energy of people who were doing their jobs but had stopped being seen while doing them. She thought about Carl, 7 years of dishes, the specific knowledge in his hands and his attention, never asked. She thought about what it would mean to build something where the Sandras were the model. Not a program, not a training module, just a place where the people doing the work were actually seen by the people responsible for the work, where the supply closets got restocked because someone had listened when the housekeeper talked, where the weekend scheduling got fixed because someone had asked the dishwasher what he'd change first. It seemed simple. She knew it wasn't simple. She'd been in this business long enough to know that the simplest things were the hardest to institutionalize because they required a quality of attention that couldn't be mandated, only modeled. You couldn't write a policy that said, actually care. You could only be someone who actually cared and hope it moved through the organization by example. She was going to have to be that person, for real this time. Not the version of it she'd been performing in speeches. She reached into her apron pocket. She put the business card on the table. He looked at it, then at her. My direct number, she said. Not the main line, not the assistant. Me. She paused. I don't give that out to people I don't trust. He looked at the card for a moment. He didn't pick it up immediately. I'm not, he started, stopped, tried again. I don't know what you're expecting from this. I want to be honest about that. I'm not expecting anything, she said. I'm not transacting. I'm just, she looked for the word. I'm giving you something real because you gave me something real. That's all. He picked up the card, turned it over in his hands. The same gesture she'd made with the salt shaker, she realized, turning something small over to check the weight of it. Lily wants to ask you something, he said. Victoria blinked. Where is she? Home. Friday's a school day. Teacher planning was last week. He almost smiled. I told her you were leaving today. She made me promise to ask you something. What? He looked slightly pained in the way of a father who was going to relay a question from a 6-year-old and had no control over how it landed. She wants to know if you have a horse. Victoria stared at him. She wants to know, he continued, with the resigned tone of a man committed to accuracy, if you have a horse in the city, and if not, why not? Because she has decided that everyone should have a horse, and the city is not a good reason. Victoria laughed. Again, the real kind, the surprised kind, the kind that happened when your defenses were down and something hit the right frequency. Tell her I don't have a horse, she said, but I'm going to think about her argument seriously. She'll want a follow-up answer, he said. Tell her, Victoria thought about it. Tell her that I'm going to look into whether my building allows horses. Your building is not going to allow horses. I know that, but it'll make her think I'm taking it seriously. He looked at her. The almost smile had become the real one, the one she'd seen on Friday when Lily did the impression, the one that changed his whole face. She's going to remember you, he said. I'm going to remember her, Victoria said. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that happened at the end of something, not a bad ending, just an ending, the kind that acknowledged something real had happened here without making too much noise about it. Sandra appeared with coffee, topped them both off, and withdrew with the discretion of a woman who had been reading rooms for 20 years and knew when to be invisible. What happens now for you? Victoria said. The Henderson account. The art class for Lily. She gestured vaguely. The Saturday site visits. I'll figure it out, he said. The standard answer. But this time he paused and added, I moved 2 site visits already. Found someone to cover the third on the weeks I can't. He looked at his coffee. She starts the art class in 2 weeks. Something settled in Victoria's chest. Good, she said. She's going to need more crayons, he said. She used the last of the purple on Thursday. Buy her 2 sets, Victoria said. She'll use them. I know she'll use them, he said. That's why I've been buying 1 set at a time. I'm trying to pace the expenditure. That's a losing strategy. I know, he said, but it slows things down enough that I feel like I have some control. She smiled at the table. He was looking out the window again, the morning light on his face, and she thought about what Sandra had said. A good man, not in the dramatic way, just, actually, and understood it in a way she hadn't entirely understood it the first time. The dramatic kind of good was easy to recognize. It announced itself. It needed you to see it. The actual kind was quieter. It showed up in 2 sets of crayons paced for the budget, in a tip under a coffee mug for someone who got things right every day, in standing up in a room and saying a plain thing and walking out the door without waiting to see how it landed. She had a world full of dramatic kind good, and had been so used to it that she'd stopped noticing how much she missed the other kind. She looked at the time. I should go, she said. He nodded. She slid out of the booth, stood, straightened the apron she was about to take off for the last time. Ethan, she said. He looked up. What you did on Tuesday? She stopped herself. She'd already thanked him. She didn't want to make it smaller by repeating it. She reorganized. I've been thinking about the kind of person I want to be, not the CEO version, just the actual version. She paused. I think I'd like to be the kind of person who does what you did in that room. He looked at her for a moment. You already are, he said. You just didn't know when to do it yet. She didn't have an answer for that. She went to the back, untied the apron, folded it on the hook where Frank had told her to leave it on her last day. She changed her shoes. She picked up her bag. She went back out through the kitchen. Kevin was already deep in lunch prep, moving through the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a man who lived in the rhythm of the work. She stood at the pass for a moment. Kevin, she said. He looked up. The walk-in cooler door, she said. The seal on the bottom left corner is going. It's been letting cold out. You're losing temperature during the morning rush. He stared at her, then looked at the walk-in, then back at her. Has been bothering me, he said slowly, for 3 weeks. Tell Frank today, she said. Don't let it go to the weekend. He nodded. Something in his expression that was surprised, but not quite. The look of someone who'd half expected there was more to this woman than the apron had suggested. You're not actually passing through, are you? He said. I am, she said, just not in the way you mean. She went out the service door into the morning air. She stood on the sidewalk outside Millie's Corner Diner in Clover Falls and looked at the street for a moment. The hardware store, the slightly cracked sidewalk, the fountain in the park that wasn't running. The town that had been nobody for 5 days and had turned out to be considerable. Her car was in the motel lot 3 blocks away. She had a 300-mile drive ahead of her, a 2 o'clock meeting she'd pushed twice, a company waiting for her, a decision to announce, and a list of things she was going to do differently that she was still writing in her head. She started walking. She was halfway down Main Street when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, James, her assistant, confirming the 2 o'clock. She typed back, I'll be there. Clear the rest of the afternoon. I need to talk to the whole acquisitions team. She put the phone away. She thought about what she was going to say to the acquisitions team. Not the version she'd planned 6 weeks ago, the clean financial case, the strategic rationale, the projected ROI. That was all still true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and she'd spent 5 days in a diner learning that the part you left out was usually the part that mattered. She was going to tell them about the housekeepers, about Carl, about 7 years of dishes and one question that had never been asked. She was going to tell them that the job was not to buy a property and fix its finances. The job was to walk into something and understand what it felt like to be a person moving through it, and then make it feel better, and then verify that it felt better by walking through it again, as nobody, without warning. She was going to tell them that she'd spent a week working in a small diner for $70 a day, and had learned more about what they were supposed to be doing than she'd learned in the previous 9 years. She thought they'd have questions. She was ready for the questions. She picked up the car, loaded her bag, sat in the driver's seat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The business card was still in her jacket pocket. Ethan's wallet was on a table somewhere in Clover Falls with her direct number in it. Whether he'd use it or not, she didn't know. She wasn't sure it mattered in the transactional sense. It mattered in the other sense. The one that said, this person was real. This week was real. I was changed by it. And I want to mark that with something concrete. She'd marked it. She started the car. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, she pulled off the interstate into the city. The skyline came up on her left, the particular density of it. Buildings stacked and overlapping, the sound of the highway thickening into something more continuous as traffic built around her. The city doing what cities did, asserting itself, demanding the full bandwidth of your attention, filling every available space. She'd grown up in a city smaller than this one. She'd moved here at 24 with $40,000 borrowed from her mother and an idea that was either going to work or wasn't. It had worked and then kept working, and she'd never left. She had not, until this week, considered what it cost to never leave. She thought about Lily asking about horses. She thought about the mirror drawing 8 legs and an ambitious mane. She thought about what it meant to make something and put it somewhere, even if nobody asked you to, even if it didn't look the way you meant it to. She thought about Ethan's face when he looked at his daughter, that helpless, undefended love that he didn't know he was showing. She thought about Sandra saying 9 words on a bad morning and how that had been enough. How enough was sometimes a very small thing, if it was the right thing. She took the exit toward her office. She was not the same person who had left here 5 days ago. She knew that with the quiet certainty of someone who had been somewhere that changed the calibration of things, not dramatically, not in ways she could fully itemize yet, but structurally. In the bones of how she saw rooms and read people and understood what the work was actually for. The work was for the Carls and the Denises. It was for the housekeeper on the 4th floor who'd been saying the same thing for years. It was for the people who got things right every day without being recognized for it. It was for the rooms that needed someone to walk into them and actually pay attention. She had always been good at the work. She was going to start being good at that part too. She parked in the garage beneath her building. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about a single father in a flannel shirt in a small booth in a diner, 45 seconds every morning that belonged entirely to him, before the day started and the world needed something. She thought about what it cost him, every day, to keep showing up with his whole self. For Lily, for the job, for the strangers in rooms who needed someone to say the plain thing. She thought about what it cost and what it built. She got out of the car. The elevator to her office smelled the way elevators in office buildings smelled. Recycled air and faint cologne, and the particular anonymity of a space that existed purely to move people between floors without asking anything of them. She rode it to the 14th floor and stepped out into the hallway and walked to her office and opened the door. James looked up from his desk. Professional, unsurprised, already reaching for the stack of things she needed to look at. This was his gift. He treated her re-entry from anywhere as completely unremarkable, which was exactly what she needed from him. 2 o'clock confirmed, he said. Williams and Park are in from Chicago. Hendricks called twice. And your sister called the office line, which she never does, just to say... He checked his notes. She said to tell you she's glad you sounded like yourself. Victoria stood at the door of her office. She thought about the phone call. 22 minutes. I don't know, but I think I'm closer to figuring out what the question actually means. And her sister's saying, well, that's something. It was something. She dropped her bag on the chair inside the door. Tell Hendricks I'll call him Monday, she said. Clear the hour after the 2 o'clock. I want to talk to the team informally, not in the conference room. She paused. And James, have someone send coffee from the place on Mercer. Not the building stuff, the good stuff. She thought about it. And find out who's been at the front desk the longest. I want to talk to them. James looked up from writing. The front desk. Of this building, she said. Whoever's been there the longest, ask them what they'd fix first. She looked at him. Don't tell them who's asking yet, just ask. He wrote it down without commenting. She had always valued this about him. She walked to her desk. She sat down. She looked out the window at the city, dense and loud and relentlessly itself, the skyline she'd looked at for 9 years from this chair. She picked up her phone. She opened her contacts. She'd put them in last night, the number she'd memorized from the business card she'd had printed 7 years ago when she was first trying to make the company feel real. Victoria Hayes, Hayes Group. Before she understood that the company would become real with or without the cards. She typed, made it back. Second property was better, going to buy both. Thank you for the kitchen advice. She put the phone face down on the desk. She pulled up the Meridian file. She opened the acquisition summary. She looked at the numbers, clean and arranged and telling the story of a thing that could be purchased and improved and turned into something worth being in. For the first time in a long time, she felt the work the way she used to feel it. Before it got abstract, before it got big enough to become about itself. The pull of something broken that she could fix, not for the margin it would produce, but for the specific human fact of it. The Carl who'd been there 7 years, the Denise who was watching the floor flood for the 7th time, the front desk clerk who'd stopped seeing the people in front of him because nobody had seen him in so long. She could fix those things. She was good at fixing things. She opened a new document. She started writing. Her phone buzzed once, a few minutes later. She didn't pick it up immediately. She was in the middle of a sentence, and she'd learned this week, slowly, that some things could wait for the end of a sentence. She finished it. She picked up the phone. Good. Do it right. And then, a second later, Lily says her building also probably doesn't allow horses, but she keeps asking. Solidarity. Victoria looked at the message for a long moment. She thought about a 6-year-old with paint on her sleeve and a drawing of an impossible horse folded carefully in her jacket pocket. She thought about the kind of father who told her that the making of things mattered more than the perfection of them, and then backed it up by actually living that way, by getting up every morning and doing the imperfect, necessary, unglamorous work of raising a person and building something and being present in rooms where presence was needed. She thought about what it meant that the most clarifying week of her professional life had happened in a diner where she'd been paid $70 and had dropped a spoon and said the wrong thing out loud and been laughed at by strangers, and then seen for the first time in years by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing her. She typed back, "Tell her the horse argument is still under review. Also tell her the flower was the best part. She'll know what that means." She set the phone down. She looked at the city through the window, at the document open on her screen, at the work waiting for her. The real version of it, the version she was going to do differently now, with her hands in it and her attention on the rooms and the people who moved through them. She took a breath. She went back to the work. Outside, somewhere in Clover Falls, a man in a flannel shirt was on a job site by now, working through the particular physical grammar of a day that demanded everything and offered nothing glamorous in return, and doing it anyway with the quiet, unperformative competence of someone who understood that most of what mattered happened without an audience. And in a classroom somewhere, a girl with 2 slightly uneven braids was probably drawing something on something she wasn't supposed to be drawing on. Making something, putting it somewhere. The strongest thing in the room, sometimes, was not the loudest thing. It was not the most powerful thing, or the most expensive thing, or the most certain thing. It was the thing that kept showing up, that got up on bad mornings and did the work anyway, that stood up in rooms and said the plain thing and walked out the door without waiting to see how it landed, that held the door for the person coming in behind them, that left a good tip for the people who got things right every day, because somebody deserved to be recognized for it. Victoria Hayes looked at her screen. She thought about the question her sister asked every year, "Are you happy?" and thought about the answer she was building, not the complicated, exhausting one she'd always offered, something simpler, something closer. She started typing.